Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Stalin and the British Road to Socialism by Andy Brooks from 2008. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So we recently concluded the second leg of the anti-Browderism or First Wave USA Anti-Revisionism playlist, and we'll be starting the third leg of that playlist in about 6 months, summer 2025. But to close out this year, we are going to do some UK anti-revisionism, specifically two pieces from Michael McCreary, The Way Forward, and Destroy the Old to Build the New, both from the early 60s. And in these pieces, McCreary, who was associated with groups such as Committee to Defeat Revisionism for Communist Unity, which was a Maoist/Albanian group critical of the USSR under Khrushchev, directed some criticism at his country's home party, the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain. In the post-war period, the CPGB came out with a document called The British Road to Socialism, which laid out an alleged blueprint for a peaceful parliamentary path to socialism in the UK. So, of course, in communist circles, that kind of sentiment had been denounced as revisionist for decades. But the curious thing here is that Stalin himself allegedly had given his consent, approval, maybe even some input into this document. So before we tackle McCreary's readings, I wanted to get into this one, which discusses the substance, at least as much as is known, regarding Stalin's relationship to the British Road to Socialism, as Stalin is certainly an important figure for anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninists, particularly on a question as basic as this. So let's get into the article and see what author Andy Brooks had to say back in September of 2008, in an article which could be found at revolutionarydemocracy.org. For years, we had been told that Joseph Stalin himself had played a part in the drafting of the first edition of the British Road to Socialism, or BRS. During the struggle led by Sid French against revisionism in the old Communist Party, which we left in 1977, the revisionists of the old CPGB would occasionally throw that back in our faces to somehow justify the failed policies of the parliamentary road that had marginalized the British communist movement for decades. Not often and not loudly, because the revisionists obviously did not wish to be seen appealing to Stalin, and the anti-revisionists didn't like to think that Stalin could have approved of the BRS. Nor did any of them ever publicly spell out what Stalin's role had been, because the now forgotten men at the helm of the old party in those days had taken their lead from Khrushchev and demonized Stalin to justify their own departure from Marxism-Leninism. Most of us believed that if Stalin had seen the draft of the first BRS, it had just been looked at and returned with the diplomatic courtesy and acceptance due to a fraternal party's internal affairs. Now it is clear that this was not the case. Indian Marxist scholar Professor Vijay Singh, the editor of Revolutionary Democracy, has discovered the minutes of meetings and letters between Stalin and the CPGB General Secretary Harry Pollitt in 1950 that reveal that Stalin and the Soviet Party had a serious input into the program, and that on the whole their amendments were accepted by the CPGB. Vijay Singh uses these documents to argue that the first British road reflected the line developed by Georgy Dimitrov and others on people's democracy, and that it only became a reformist and social democratic program with the adoption of the second major revision in 1957, which was clearly influenced by Khrushchev and the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or CPSU. And just a quick comment there from me about Dimitrov. I have done some Dimitrov readings, as his work on fascism and the Popular Front are widely cited, but there are some, increasingly including me at this point, who are more critical of the Popular Front policies that were adopted by the Comintern during Dimitrov's tenure, as being somewhat opportunist and possibly misleading to the communist movement, particularly in Western Europe, as it did contribute to the defeat of the Axis powers in World War II, but possibly put too much emphasis on class collaboration and took too much emphasis away from revolution. I mentioned the anti-Browderism playlist before, and that was Browderism to a T, the class collaboration to the point where Browder wound up saying that monopoly capital was considered a progressive force. So obviously that could be taken to extremes. The question is, under Dimitrov, was it taken too far by the communist movement as a whole? Another instance of it is the people's democracy concept that was mentioned in the text. That was the theoretical framework that was developed to explain and describe most of the Eastern European socialist post-war governments. And also revolutionary China, although China was starting from a very different position in terms of its class composition. We'll discuss that more in a separate video. Anyway, that's kind of a side topic, but I wanted to mention it for context when we're talking about revisionism and the effects of Dimitrovism maybe leaking into the CPGB. Of course, also Khrushchev was mentioned. If you're interested in the topic of Khrushchev and modern revisionism, we have another playlist on the channel on the Sino-Soviet split. And that discusses a lot of the same topics of peaceful parliamentary paths to socialism. So there was a lot of that going around at the time, as had been the case among the more reformist wing of the socialist movement for some time. But the real concern here was that it was now popping up not just in the more social democratic parties, but within the communist vanguard itself. And just as a quick reminder, when we talk about revisionism in a Marxist context, we mean bourgeois ideas entering the communist vanguard and pushing out proletarian revolutionary ideas. Again, when bourgeois ideas enter the communist vanguard, we call it revisionism. When it enters the general workers' movement, the result is social democracy. Okay, just want to bring everybody up to speed because we do have some more experienced communists who have studied for a longer period of time listening to this, and also beginners, so we want to give everybody a decent chance of understanding what's being discussed. Anyway, let's continue. The documents found by Vijay Singh consist of summary of letters and meetings between Harry Pollitt and Suslov, dated the 23rd of May 1950, minutes of a meeting between Pollitt and Stalin on the 31st of May 1950, a letter from Pollitt to Stalin from the 11th of July 1950, Stalin's reply signed Your Code Discussant from the 28th of September 1950, Pollitt's response written in Bucharest on the 18th of October 1950, and the transcript of a meeting between Pollitt, Stalin, and Molotov from the 5th of January 1951. And they are held by the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History. First of all, we have to consider the authenticity of the documents published in Revolutionary Democracy, if only because some self-styled Stalinists in Britain are suggesting that they're forgeries. Forged not by Professor Singh himself, but by revisionist historians who planted these papers in the Soviet state archives. But this state of denial simply reflects dogmatism and ignorance of the history of the CPGB. The idea that anyone would go to the trouble of forging correspondence between Stalin and a relatively minor Western European Communist Party in the hope that it would then be discovered by a Marxist scholar decades later is of course absurd. But in any case, Stalin's meetings with Pollitt were never a secret within the highest echelons of the old party. Mike Power, a former leading Euro-communist, states that George Matthews, a former editor of the Daily Worker and the Morning Star, and a leading revisionist within the CPGB throughout most of its existence, knew that, quote, Stalin had influenced the contents of the party program, The British Road to Socialism, hailed as a purely homegrown product, unquote, in the obituary he wrote for Matthews in The Guardian of April 8, 2005. Professor Singh argues that the first edition of The British Road to Socialism was correct. He says, quote, the new party program, which was adopted in 1951, The British Road to Socialism, necessarily took into account the new correlation of forces on a world scale, the experiences gained after the 7th Congress of the Comintern, particularly with the establishment of the new democracies and people's democracies in Central and Southeast Europe, and the Chinese Revolution. The new party program was not one of establishing a Soviet Socialist Britain, but of establishing a people's democracy in Britain. Comment, why would you do that? Continuing, as one of the subheadings of the program states, People's Democracy, the Path to Socialism. It was the road to socialism, and so it did not envisage the immediate establishment of socialism, based on workers' councils, the immediate establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the destruction of parliament, the civil service, the police, the military, the judiciary, and the rest of the bourgeois state apparatus. Drawing on the experiences of the people's democracies of Central and Southeast Europe, the British Road envisaged the utilization of parliament and the formation of a people's government based on the various sections of the working class movement, labor, trade union, cooperative, and communist, based on a parliamentary majority. In the economic sphere, the road to socialism envisaged socialist nationalization and workers' control of monopoly capital and big landed property, but not the properties of the small shopkeepers, businessmen, small landowners, and farmers in the countryside. The British Empire was to be transformed, inspired, it is clear, by the example of the Soviet Union into a, quote, strong, free, equal association of peoples by granting national independence to the colonies, unquote. The British road to socialism in the editions of 1951 and 1952 does not refer to a peaceful transition to socialism. On the contrary, the program anticipated that, quote, in carrying through these decisive measures to implement the democratic will of the people, every effort of the capitalist class to defy the people's government and parliament will be resisted and defeated. The great broad popular alliance led by the working class, firmly based on the factories, which has democratically placed the people's government in power, will have the strength to deal with the attacks of the capitalist warmongers and their agents. The government will rely on the strength of the organized workers to ensure that the program decided upon by Parliament is operated in practice, and that attempts to resist or sabotage it are defeated, and the enemies of the working class brought to justice. It would be wrong to believe that the big capitalists will voluntarily give up their property and their big profits in the interest of the British people. It would be more correct to expect them to offer an active resistance to the decisions of the people's government, and to fight for the retention of their privileges by all means in their power, including force. Therefore, the British people and the people's government should be ready decisively to rebuff such attempts, unquote. B.J. Singh argues that the revisionist line only appears in the subsequent editions published after the 20th Congress of the CPSU and the general line of Nikita Khrushchev and his followers. But is there any essential difference between the first and the last British road to socialism? It's clear from these documents that Stalin approved of the formulations of the first draft of the BRS, but what were Stalin's views based on? The CPSU papers are unfortunately one-sided, in that they only record the minutes, marked top secret, taken by the Soviet side during the discussions, along with some written exchanges between Pollitt and Stalin concerning the draft. The Stalin leadership clearly based their advice on an assessment of the British communist movement that must have come largely from the CPGB in the first place. The CPGB, even in Pollitt's day, regularly exaggerated its importance and influence within the British labor movement, and there are some hints of this in the Soviet record of Pollitt's comments. So to comment myself here, whether or not you consider this anticipation of force to be sufficiently anti-revisionist, that this whole let's take over Parliament strategy not to be revisionist in the first place, no matter what they anticipated, it should be noted that nothing like this ever came to pass. So they took this whole parliamentary strategy and making a people's democracy out of one of the most advanced imperialist powers, but they didn't even get close to that. So what was the point of this? And then the mention that the CPGB would exaggerate their importance, it reminds me of a lot of what came up during the anti-Browderism readings, where it's the CPUSA talking about, their place within the politics, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And it's like, you don't have the membership or the influence to do any of that. So it comes off as this kind of delusional imagining of the communists' position within the national politics as being capable of calling shots that it simply can't call. So when things happen, it's like, oh, we agree with it, we support it or not. And it doesn't really matter, actually, whether you support it or not, because you just don't have any pull. At least not sufficient pull for it to matter. And consequently, the retreat from revolutionary politics is not in any way justified by this. Let's continue. For instance, Comrade Stalin says that within the English working class there are taking place certain processes that are seen, but which are unnoticeable from the outside, that explain the fact that the conservatives managed to amass such a large quantity of votes in the last elections. To illustrate the processes taking place in the English electorate that are not observable for an outside observer, he, Comrade Stalin, could cite the fact that the results of the elections in 1945 in England were unexpected for Churchill and Eden, as well as for Attlee and Bevan. Labourites as well as conservatives have an apparatus, informing the leadership of the party about the mood of the electors. In 1945, Churchill was confident of his victory in the elections, and Attlee did not expect the victory of the Labourites. The information providing apparatus let them down. Apparently in 1945, in the mood of the electors, there took place some hidden internal processes, as a result of which the Labourites unexpectedly emerged victorious, and at the present time, too, something is happening to the mood of the British working class. Pollitt answers that in 1945, nobody expected the victory of the Labourites because every worker out of millions of English workers who had lived through the hard years of depression when the Conservatives were in power took a decision for themselves that they shall not permit the Conservatives to come to power. Comrade Stalin comments that neither the leaders of the Labourites nor the Conservatives could understand this. Pollitt answers that this happened because the leaders did not continue in their contact with the masses of the English people, as also during the war years the working people of England openly talked among themselves in bomb shelters and in the metro, where they used to take shelter from bombings, that they shall never again permit the Conservatives to come to power. But Pollitt does not explain that the CPGB leadership was also taken by surprise by the massive swing to labor in 1945, and that it must therefore have been as equally out of touch with the mass of the people as the leaders of the other parties. Here Stalin asks a question that Pollitt simply evades. Comrade Stalin asks, why did the Conservatives get such a large number of votes? Pollitt answers that the number of votes cast for the Labourites on the last elections in industrial regions of England has grown significantly, and on the whole, as a party, the Labourites got unprecedentedly more votes in the history of England. Comrade Stalin observes that nonetheless the Conservatives also got a large number of votes. Pollitt answers that the Labour Party got a record number of votes in the last elections. In 1945, the Labourites attracted the middle classes to their side. In 1950, the Labourites lost the support of the middle classes, who were not happy with the taxes, rationing of benzene, and other steps of the Labour government that hurt the interests of the small shopkeepers. However, the miners, shipbuilders, workers in the heavy machine building industry, textile workers, metallurgists, they all together voted for the Labourites. All these sections of the working class had experienced the years of depression during pre-war days when the Conservatives were in power. Now they think that the Labour government will save them from the onslaught of a new depression. Similarly, this fact also requires attention that England has millions of voters who are between 25 and 35 years of age. These voters have never known unemployment, have not experienced on their own skin the effects of lockouts, and have not participated in the demonstrations of the unemployed. Their salaries today are higher than ever earlier. To the same, one may add that factually, at the moment there is no unemployment in England. Stalin presses the point. Comrade Stalin again asks if at present there is no unemployment in England. Pollitt answers that the general quantity of unemployed in England at the moment consists of 350,000, while the unemployed in the main are the old people. The concentration of unemployed has the following distribution: Liverpool 40,000, South Wales 35,000, Scotland 50,000. All these in the main are old people. Pollitt says that the English workers, obsessed by the danger of Conservatives coming to power, do not vote for the Communists, as they do not want a division of votes of those candidates who are inclined against the Conservatives. English workers think that there is no sense in voting for the English Communists, as the English Communists have no chance of coming to power. Comment, that sure sounds familiar. Continuing, Comrade Stalin says, in any case, in the mood of the electorate, certain changes are taking place that favor Conservatives. Pollitt answers that, taking recourse to all kinds of demagogy, the Conservatives have organized a strong youth movement. Comrade Stalin says that certain sections of the English electors have been disillusioned from the Labourites. It is not just chance that the Conservatives got such large numbers of votes in the last elections. Pollitt answers that the middle classes have left the Labourites, which the Conservatives captured to their side by promising change in a number of limitations, including the rationing of benzene. Conservatives were also succeeded in gathering to their side a large number of votes by playing on the mood for peace among the people. As is well known, during the election campaign, Churchill made the announcement that, in case of the Conservatives being elected, he will personally talk to the Soviet leaders. This trick of Churchill's put the Labourites in confusion. Bevan very messily replied to the speech of Churchill's. Pollitt said that some workers were influenced by the announcement of the Conservatives that, with a more close relationship with the Americans, which they could support after coming to power, the English working class shall be guaranteed against unemployment. Once again, Pollitt avoids explaining why the swing back to the Tories in the 1950 elections. He barely covers the issue of rationing or the growing Cold War hysteria, and seems to imply that Labour's victory in 1945 was due to a swing in favor of Labour amongst the middle classes. The Cold War was at its height back when Pollitt and Stalin met. People's democracies had been established in China, North Korea, and throughout Eastern Europe. In Vietnam, a communist-led resistance was fighting to drive the French colonialists out, and US-led imperialists were about to plunge the Korean peninsula in flames in an attempt to snuff out the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. The peoples of the Indian subcontinent had broken the chains of British colonialism, and throughout what we would later call the Third World, the struggle to smash the European colonial empires was beginning. Though Yugoslavia under Marshal Tito had broken with the Soviets and turned to the West, the then massive French and Italian communist parties fired the hope that the march to socialism was at hand in Western Europe as well. British communists could be forgiven for thinking that the balance of forces in the world was now irreversibly tilting in favor of the Soviet Union and the new world socialist camp. But that wasn't the only agenda behind the British road to socialism. Left social democratic ideas that had existed within the CPGB from its earliest days clearly came to the fore when the party's rules were changed in 1943, following the dissolution of the Communist International. Comment, in my view, a grave blow to the world communist movement. Continuing, the 1951 document not only assumes a constitutional road, but also a peaceful road in what it says and, more importantly, in what it omits. It downgrades industrial work, where the CPGB did have significant strength, in favor of campaigning in the localities in pursuit of the illusion of winning seats in parliament, and by so doing, creating an artificial barrier that divided the party between industrial branches and local and area committees. Contrary to popular myth, factory branches were not dissolved throughout the party, though this did occur in some districts. But the role of factory branches was sidelined by the party's district committees, while National Industrial Organization concentrated on developing party advisory committees, which were union-based, to concentrate on union election campaigns and developing the broad left movement rather than building the party at the workplace. Though the BRS recognized the significance of the Labour Party and the trade union movement, it perpetuated the myth that a left social democratic electoral alternative to Labour could succeed, while at the same time calling for working class unity in the fight for social justice and the re-election of a Labour government. After over half a century of failure, it is clear that British roadism is a road to nowhere. But these myths continue today in the various British roads of the revisionist Communist Party of Britain, and amongst the left social democratic and Trotskyist movements like George Galloway's Respect, the Socialist Party, and the SWP. These documents from the Soviet archives are important for our understanding of our own communist history, and Professor Singh should be congratulated for making them available to the public. But there's nothing in them that would shake us from our consistent view that the BRS was revisionist from the very beginning. And that is the end of the audiobook. I have to say I agree with that closing sentiment, and overall I hope that this article has served as useful context and a stepping stone for our next two articles from Michael McCreary. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. This channel is entirely viewer supported. We don't run ads or sponsorships, so kicking in a few dollars really helps, whether it's one time or recurring. I would make some kind of content even if nobody supported, but that support really has allowed me to build the channel over the last 5 years by allowing me to spend a lot more time on developing it. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter and consider becoming one yourself. Big thanks there. Also, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, that does really help. And remember, take what you've learned here online into your local left, use it to inform your decision-making and voting in the various organizations that you're a member of, and network with other local comrades so that even if the projects that you want to see aren't there yet, when conditions are better, you'll already know people you might be able to talk to about getting something going. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.